just give folks 2 seconds, maybe 5 seconds to join us this morning. As you can see, we're also, this is a hybrid event. So we're being hosted by the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders in their New York office. And this is the very first time that we're actually having a hybrid event of its kind. So bear with us if there are any technical issues, but there really shouldn't be any. And again, welcome to you all. If you're joining us from Asia, thanks so much for staying up with us. And if you're joining us from Canada, thank you already for being awake at this early in the morning. So let's start. So my name is Eliška Jelinkova. I'm the co-director at the United Network of Young Peacebuilders. I also co-chair the Global Coalition on Youth, Peace and Security. And UNOY is also the co-chair of the Civil Society Working Group on Youth, Peace and Security. And that is the working group that is hosting the event this morning, alongside with the partners from the NYU Center for Global Affairs, who are also here with us in person and joining us online. So why are we here this today? So as you might have noticed by now, the second SG's report on youth, peace and security was published in March of this year, and it's July, and we still haven't had an open debate on in the Security Council. And of course, young people have a lot to say when it comes to what is in the report and what isn't. And we're also joined, as I said, by our young researchers from NYU who have conducted research. So they're also going to be sharing their contributions. We have quite an exciting program for today. So we have 2 panels. The first panel is going to be young peacebuilders who will reflect on the SG's report, giving their recommendations and their reflections. And then we have a second panel of young researchers from NYU who will present their research findings. We have 3 main objectives for this event. So the first one is to really dive down into the second report of the Secretary General, as it has not been discussed by any UN body or, as far as we know, by any other civil society network. We will also present recommendations for youth-led effective implementation, accountability of YPS resolutions based on the research conducted by the researchers from NYU. And this is also a space to encourage greater investment in and recognition of young people's critical contribution to peace building and humanitarian action. So as always, we're quite ambitious. We have 1.5 hours and a lot of great speakers and researchers to go through. So I will hand it over straight away to João Scarpellini, who is here with us, who's going to give his reflections on the process of the SG's report. So over to you, João.
Thank you very much, Eliška. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. Thanks also GNWP for hosting us today and for all the organizers. It is in fact an opportunity for us for the first time to discuss the SG report. We're very excited for this. More than sharing my reflections, I want to talk a little bit about the process and just basically bring us up to speed in terms of what happened until now, so then we can discuss what is next. I'm also just want to acknowledge I'm joined here by Matteo Busto from the PPA, which was one of the entities that were the pen holders. So welcome. Jumping in terms of the process. So as you know, this is the second report. The first report was published in 2020, in March 2020, and was a response to the second Security Council resolution on youth, peace and security, resolution 2419. That first resolution requested the SG to provide one report on the state of YPS. So that report really covered everything that happened from the first, so from 2015 all the way to 2020. And then the latest Security Council resolution 2535 institutionalized this mechanism. So that resolution is specifically asked the Secretary General to report every 2 years on the implementation of the YPS agenda. And so the second report is the first time that it's really an institutionalized thing. Nevertheless, institutionalization doesn't mean it's necessarily being taken as a priority by the council members. I want to talk a little bit about the process, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual key messages or findings from this report. So, as I mentioned, the report covers the 2 years period between 2020 and up to 2022. It is one thing that I think it's important to explain always, it is a SG report. So even though there are entities that are acting as pen holders, the report has to reflect the views of the Secretary General. And it is a very political tool. Beyond YPS, the SG has almost every week a different SG report being launched on various teams. And so the process of developing those reports are very much structured and institutionalized. We have very strict word counts, which often is, I think, the biggest nightmare and the enemy of anything. We have literally 8,500 words to include everything that happened within the scope of that topic, so that report. The second report was a joint effort by 3 entities, so UNFPA, the Peacebuilding Support Office of DPPA, the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, as well as OSGE, the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth. But we tried our best to really ensure there was an open process for engagement. We used 4 main ways of collecting data and consolidating the report. There was a call for submission that was released already last year. There was 3 different types of calls, one really targeting member states. And for that, we really tried to understand how member states were doing institutionally the implementation of YPS agenda. We also had a specific call for UN entities, so trying to understand how the UN system is responding to the resolutions and how it's translating the resolutions into action. And most importantly, call open to civil society, and within that, of course, targeting youth-led organizations. In addition to that, we try to organize consultations. Of course, it's a little challenging because we don't really have the draft until very late in the process. So in the scope of the Global Coalition, we had 2 discussions on the report. One was really at the very beginning of the process, trying to use the coalition to help us frame what would be the report. And then later on in the process, we had a second consultation where we started to try to brainstorm what would be the key messages or what we were trying to convey with the process. As I mentioned, we only have 8,500 words, so we knew from the beginning we wouldn't be able to cover everything that YPS is all about. So this time, for the first time, we also open a call for thematic papers. And basically anybody could produce a thematic paper. Was a very interesting initiative. So we have about 40 different thematic papers that were started. We already have about 20 that were finalized. What I think it's important to say about the thematic papers, that those had no sort of editorial control. So individual entities could publish whatever they feel. Was also an incredible opportunity to really understand the depth of YPS. Like, you would have papers from queer experiences of YPS to nuclear disarmament to climate change. So really, it was also a very powerful tool to show people that YPS is not just a marginal, isolated agenda, but it's really cross-cutting and has a lot of that. And beyond that, we had a core group that was mostly with representatives from the UN system, but also we had a couple of representatives from civil society, and that group was the one more involved into the actual drafting and reviewing. Jumping straight into the recommendations, just to say, so the report has kind of 3 sections. One is really like kind of setting the theme, because the report covered 2020 to 2022. Of course, COVID was the big issue. So the first part really looked into how COVID impacted peace and security and how COVID impacted the work of young people to implement peace and security. The second part really go through the 5 pillars of YPS. And so we try to basically bring examples from the UN system and from civil society and of course member states on how they were implementing the 5 pillars of YPS. The last section really looks into what are the institutionalization. This time, the first one, that part was very light. This second report, that was probably the core of the report. So really looking what are the steps to institutionalize at the different levels by different stakeholders, and then of course recommendations in the end. If I can, just to conclude, in terms of some key findings, other recommendations, of course, because it's the SG report, he provided recommendations to the UN, to the Security Council, and to member states. And so just some examples for the UN, the SG have recommended that in the terms of reference of all the senior leadership, they should really try to incorporate YPS. So the same way we have very strong language on the role of senior leadership in promoting gender equality, we also want to make sure that the TORs reflect the role of young people and that senior leadership really encourage that. We also try to encourage the establishment of a fund for the protection of young peacebuilders, building on, and this was a very strong call from civil society, learning from the example of Afghanistan that the UN was unable to support. And so really explore what are the mechanisms we can have in place to prevent these kinds of situations from ever happening again, and really building the YPS capacity within the field. For the Security Council, a very specific recommendation was really incorporating YPS into the mandates of the special political missions and the peacekeeping operations. So really institutionalizing, but also requesting in those mandates that the missions have to work with on the aspect of financing. I think one of the key messages is that there is, and it's never enough, but there is a lot of resources being allocated to youth peace building, but the report makes it very clear that the access to these resources is not fair yet. And so the report really pushed for exploring ways to make funding flexible, more long-term, and more sustainable, and especially available and accessible for youth-led organizations. I'll conclude here, Katrina, but I don't know if back to Alicia or Katrina.
Thank you so much, Joe, for demystifying the process of coming up and creating the report of the Secretary General, and for also summarizing some of the key recommendations and giving us an overall understanding of what is in the second report. And I will give the floor to Katrina, who's the Director for Africa, Latin America, and Middle East Programs and Communications from GNWP. Over to you, Katrina.
Thank you so much, Eliska, and thank you for that overview, Joe. And thank you so much for joining us, colleagues. All of you, thank you for joining us for this event commemorating the second report of the Secretary General on Youth, Peace, and Security. We're so excited to see that there was and is indeed a second report. But also thank you for coming to hear from youth peacebuilders themselves on their thoughts on this report and how this aligns to the work that they're doing on the ground. And then thirdly, thank you for joining us to launch the research findings from the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders and the New York University Center for Global Affairs partnership. This research is focused this year on youth inclusivity and national level policy processes. And I'm very excited that several, and I think almost all of the students who participated in the research will be here with us. And of course, I want to recognize Dr. Anne-Marie Getz, who is a close friend of GNWP's and the clinical professor at NYU who has been pioneering this practicum with us. And so thank you so much for your partnership, Anne-Marie, and thank you so much for being here as well. It's really my pleasure to share some brief opening remarks on behalf of the GNWP team and as one of the co-chairs of the Civil Society Working Group on Youth, Peace, and Security, along with our friends at UNOY. As we know, the adoption of Resolution 2250 on Youth, Peace, and Security has been acknowledged as a significant milestone towards recognizing young people as agents of change, in leaders, in peace and sustainability, and specifically in inclusive peace. The adoption of the two subsequent UN resolutions in 2018 and then in 2020 has strengthened the role of young people in peace building, particularly in humanitarian action, even though we know that long before these resolutions existed, young people were already doing this work on the ground. Likewise, it also reiterates the role that member states have in ensuring young people's meaningful engagement at all levels of decision-making. Pursuant to this, the first and now the second report from the Secretary General on implementing the resolutions on youth peace and security were released, as we've said, in March 2020 and now March 2022. The reports highlighted young people's contributions to peace building or building peace in general, while analyzing the progress made in each pillar of YPS. And we know that these things happen only because young people are making the efforts and putting the work on the ground. I'm personally quite excited to read in the report that several national level youth-led youth peace and security coalitions, which were formed in the last 3 years, are cited, including in my home country here in Canada. Young people in Canada, El Salvador, India, Iraq, Norway, Somalia, Sudan, Sweden, the US, as well as occupied Palestinian territory have all formed national youth peace and security coalitions in their countries. Congratulations to all these young people who are themselves being the leaders of today and not the infamous leaders of tomorrow that we keep hearing about. It's an exciting and telling improvement in enhancing partnerships, one of the pillars of youth peace and security, while also recognizing, of course, the leadership of young people themselves towards implementing youth peace and security domestically. Of course, we're also excited that the Civil Society Working Group on Youth Peace and Security is the front and center in the report. Having launched in 2021, our working group serves as an opportunity to improve the understanding of the policy framework, as well as advocate for the meaningful and intentional integration of civil society and youth perspectives, particularly into deliberations of the Security Council. The Civil Society Working Group, which is convening this meeting today with our partners, comprises of 147 civil society and youth-led organizations and networks from over 74 different countries around the world. The working group seeks to advocate for effective, youth-led implementation of the YPS agenda while providing a unique opportunity to mobilize local youth towards and promoting accountability for the operationalization of the resolutions themselves. As we convene today, on the sidelines of the high-level political forum on sustainable development, I also want to highlight the strategic opportunity to strengthen accountability for effective youth-led implementation of YPS through integrating the resolutions into existing frameworks, such as the Sustainable Development Goals. We'll hear more about this, of course, but although YPS is usually framed as a peace and security framework, which it is, it relates directly to several SDGs, including Sustainable Development Goal 16. Its implementation requires, of course, addressing underlying root causes of conflicts, such as limited access to education, healthcare, and the climate crisis, which are all also Sustainable Development Goals or touch the SDGs. We'll hear more about this from my colleague Wevin in a moment. Accountability through reporting is pivotal for effective implementation on youth peace and security. It's through reporting, analysis, and critical feedback on the progress of the YPS agenda that we can identify key lessons and emerging trends to improve their programming or our programming. However, it is important to note that the reports of the Secretary General are not exhaustive. As Joa has mentioned, there is a limited word count and there are limitations beyond that. But there's also no other universal reporting mechanism on youth peace and security itself. There's no other required reporting, for example, like the Women, Peace and Security Agenda has with the CEDAW process, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination of All Forms of Violence Against Women. So many young people and other local stakeholders, especially those at the grassroots level, need to be integrated in this reporting mechanism that we do have on youth peace and security. That means facilitating access to global platforms, which we hope to do with the Civil Society Working Group, eliminating the barrier in terms of accessing the English language, for example, or even having internet to be able to access this space. Hence, there's a need to create spaces to nurture the exchange of heterogeneous perspectives, reflections, and in turn highlight young people's peace-building efforts throughout the world. This convening is an opportunity for us to gather among friends, colleagues, and allies, but it remains an opportunity to amplify our movement and raise the voices of youth peace builders themselves, which I'm so happy we have several of them here with us. Breaking silos of bureaucracies and ensuring that decision-making tables are not only inclusive, but that they're reimagined is an important part of the youth peace and security agenda. Inclusivity does not always mean fitting into a box or distorting that box slightly so we can fit in, But really, sometimes it means throwing that box right out the window and rethinking how we do things and how we operate. And so that's what I invite us to do here today and to continue to do, because several of us are already doing this. So thank you so much for being here, and back to you, Eliška.
And also thank you for presenting the Civil Society Working Group. And I will hand it over straight to Vivian Muganda, who is the current Vice Peacebuilding Fellow at GNWP, who is going to make the link to the Sustainable Development Goals. Over to you, Vivian.
Thank you, Eliška, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Because we're organizing this at the sidelines of the high-level political forum, I'm just going to talk a bit about linking the YPS agenda to the SDGs. The YPS agenda calls for recognition of young people's agency in peace building and decision making. It also calls for the meaningful participation of young people across all levels of governance. The implementation of Resolution 2250 and other succeeding resolutions ultimately contributes to sustainable peace and development. Likewise, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development recognizes young people as leaders and agents of change in their communities. SDG 16 on peaceful, just, and inclusive societies is a commitment by member states to ensure fundamental human rights, access to justice for all, and building inclusive and accountable systems of governance. Thus, SDG 16 provides a unique opportunity for young people to participate in decision-making and reiterates the pillars of the YPS agenda, particularly on participation, protection, and prevention of conflict. Although the SDG 16 focuses on peace, justice, and strong institutions, and this relates closely to the YPS agenda, the other SDGs also highlight critical aspects that need action. These include SDG 10 on reducing inequalities, SDG 4 on quality education, SDG 13 on climate action, and 17 on partnerships for the goals, just to mention a few. And this is why this discussion today is important. The HLPF is a time for all of us as stakeholders to reflect on the progress of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and identify opportunities that can accelerate efforts to ensure we leave no one behind by 2030. The voluntary national reviews by member states which can be a great opportunity to foster meaningful participation, remain exclusive to young people. Despite the enormous contribution of young people as social workers, activists, researchers, evaluators, and peace builders, their participation in the VNRs is still low, and this has an impact in the design and implementation of youth-led interventions related to the SDGs. Other barriers hindering the participation of young people in the VNRs include discrimination based on age, gender, the lack of fundamental freedoms and rights in certain countries, limited resources, and the lack of recognition of the diverse needs of young people. We also have the inadequate capacity, particularly in linking and integrating SDG targets to young people's projects and campaigns, and of course the underrepresentation of identities such as young women, LGBTQIA+ youth, refugees, young people with disability, and others. This year's HLPF includes the review of SDG 4 on quality education, 5 on gender equality, 14 on life below water, 15 on life on land, and 17 on partnerships for the goals. Now is the time to identify innovative ways to promote intersectionality and holistic implementation of the YPS agenda through looking at the ways in which young people are already engaging in YPS efforts in their SDG campaigns and initiatives. The YPS agenda is more than a peace and security agenda. If implemented fully, it addresses the socio-economic and political challenges to sustainable development. We know that peace means different things for different communities. For some, peace is having food every day. For some, it is living in a country where they can speak freely. For others, especially young women and queer youth, it is walking around safely in their communities. All of these are contributors to peace and are encompassed in the YPS agenda. For example, through the Young Women Class Leaders for Peace program, GNWP develops and sustains networks of young women and gender equality allies in conflict-affected countries, working on peace building and leadership initiatives, intersecting the YPS and women, peace, and security frameworks. This contributes to SDG 8 on gender equality, resulting in the participation of young women in peace processes. In Bangladesh, the Young Women Plus leaders, after their training on YPS and WPS, have gone on to advocate for gender-responsive humanitarian action to address the Rohingya refugee crisis. In the Philippines, they have been actively engaged in the transition to the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. Their important work was even cited by the Secretary General in his first report on YPS. As you can see, to achieve one goal is to achieve the other, because the YPS agenda is an enabler to achieving Agenda 2030 on sustainable development. As we begin this discussion today, I invite all of us to reflect on the opportunities in the implementation of the SDGs that we can leverage on to ensure the implementation of the YPS agenda. On accountability, it is time we design mechanisms that are inclusive and backed by evidence to guide stakeholders, particularly the UN and member states, on the implementation of the YPS agenda. We are making progress, but we must strengthen our implementation of this agenda to ensure that in the spirit of the 2030 agenda, we do not leave anyone behind. It is only through collective action and coordinated efforts, whether that will be through the SDGs or the YPS agenda, that we can ensure young people are truly at the center of sustainable peace and development. I look forward to all the discussions today, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Bevin, for providing us with all these linkages between youth, peace, and security agenda and with the SDGs. As some of you have heard already, what we call our SDG, SDG 16, is not on the agenda this year, but that doesn't mean that, as Bevin mentioned, YPS is not relevant in all the other SDGs and in their implementation. And in order to have a better discussion and better understanding of the different linkages and the different frameworks that were mentioned today, we'll now turn to our amazing panel of young peacebuilders to reflect on what is, again, in the Secretary General's report, what is missing, and really focus on some of the challenges, the emerging themes, ways to enhance accountability, as well as what are young people doing at the grassroots level. And we will actually start with Hila Yun, who is the founder and CEO of Afghan Youth Ambassadors for Peace. It's great to have you with us today, Hila. So what would you say are some of the emerging themes on YPS that stakeholders need to prioritize in the implementation of the YPS agenda?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I think the SDG report is covering most of the emerging themes on YPS already, but when it comes to prioritization from my side, because I grew up in Afghanistan and the current situation in Afghanistan shows that strong implementation and accountability is the two important theme and important aspect and issues that the YPS agenda or the report should reflect on. Right now, I'm going to talk more about the current situation of Afghanistan and what's happening there and why YPS agenda has kind of failed in this country. And when it comes to the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan right now, it's very bad because there have been so many natural disasters happening at the same time. The economy is not doing well. A lot of young people are unemployed, and especially women and girls don't have a basic access to education because Taliban have restricted their rights. And when it comes to YPS implementation or WPS implementation in Afghanistan or any conflict-affected countries like Afghanistan, it's important to realize the context very well and analyze the context very well. Is the country ready to implement YPS agenda? Is the government supporting the young people? What are the priorities of the young people on the ground right now? And what we can do at the international level? When these type of reports are published, it's usually just sit at the international level. It never goes to the people or the young people who actually needs it and want to know about the reports, because there is language barriers, but also lack of fundings and opportunities for young people at the grassroots level to actually know what the report is talking about. Not many people in conflict affected countries or at the local level, at the grassroots level, really know about YPS agenda and how it's so important for them to know about this and how they can use it. And the reason is because obviously we have governments, most of the governments are restricting young people. There is no civic spaces, there is no funding opportunities. And in countries like Afghanistan, where UN is having lack of presence right now at the moment because of the change of the regime, it shows why the YPS agenda in the country is so important right now, but at the same time realizing that people in Afghanistan and young people don't even have access to these type of resources and what it actually means. And the other reflection and theme that the report should focus on is that also it did focus on addressing the barriers and what barriers our young people are focusing. But also it's important that when we talk about young people, we should not forget about young women in conflict affected countries and the barriers they are facing when it comes to situations like this, where there is conflict and there is no peace, especially when the barriers are keep changing depending on the context of the countries. Right now in Afghanistan, a lot of people are saying, yeah, we do have peace, but just like Vivian said, and I want to echo what she said, that peace have different meaning to everyone. Right now that in Afghanistan, people are saying that, okay, or the Taliban are saying we don't have war anymore, but peace is not just the absence of war. Peace for women and girls in Afghanistan means that they have access to education where they can actually think about their future and able to work for their community without having any discrimination based on their genders. The SDG report also and the YPS report reflects the education and the importance of education and why it's so important for young people to have access to education. But unfortunately, it fails to mention the current education crisis in Afghanistan. Right now in Afghanistan, today has been the 300 days that women and girls in Afghanistan don't have access to education. Only women and girls can study till grade 6 and they are not allowed to study. And why is that? Because of their gender. And when we talk about YPS agenda, it's why it's so important that include women and especially young women when they don't have any resources and funding opportunities when we talk about these issues. Another theme is already reflected on the report, but shrinking civic spaces is so important. I know that a lot of young peace activists in Afghanistan are threatened right now because of their activism, and UN and other international NGOs are trying to provide that support, but unfortunately it's not enough. There is shrinking civic spaces right now in Afghanistan, and young people cannot even raise their voices because obviously there is a threat and for them and to their lives and their families as well. And that's why it's so important when we talk about emerging themes. The two important thing is accountability and implementation, meaningful implementation of the agenda on the ground, and especially in countries like Afghanistan, because it's been in war for so many decades. And when we talk about the YPS agenda, it's a perfect example. Afghanistan is a perfect example why YPS is failing there and why the UN or other international entities are not realizing the barriers and the struggles of young Afghan, especially young women on the ground. Thank you.
For sharing your perspective and your experience as a young woman peace builder in Afghanistan, and for also pointing out some of the missing themes from the SG's report, as well as giving us a very specific context-based example of how the YPS agenda and its relevance in contexts like Afghanistan these days. And we've had a great comment in the chat from, Vishal Ranamagar about the point that you raised about how can local young people be aware of this report, and also, what can they do with it? And that is actually something that our next speaker will reflect on. So we're joined by also Herbert Bangura, who's the founder and executive director of Young Peacebuilders. Herbert, it's great to have you with us. So how do you think we can bridge the gap between global policy frameworks and local action on YPS? And how can we address the challenges highlighted in the SG's report on new peace and security? Over to you.
Thank you very much, distinguished panelists, colleagues, peace builders from across Mother Earth. Ladies and gentlemen, I greet you all in the name of peace. I am profoundly grateful to have been selected to speak to this very important topic, implementation through accountability reflections on the 2022 UN Secretary General's report on youth, peace and security, in an attempt to provide answers to the questions, how can we address the challenges highlighted in the SG report on YPS? How can we bridge the gap between global policy frameworks and local action? As a youth leader and young professional myself, living and working in an underserved community in a poverty-stricken nation in Western Africa, Sierra Leone to be precise, I must begin by acknowledging the efforts of the United Nations and the UN Secretary General for laying the foundation upon which the organizers of this event or consultation are building to provide the needed platform for young people around the globe to realize their full potentials and effectively contribute towards building safer and peaceful societies. Happening for the second time, the UN Secretary General's report to the UN Security Council about youth, peace, and security agenda. The report, of course, highlights specific areas where youth peace builders work as positive examples in fostering partnerships, protection, meaningful youth engagement, and youth accessible funding. It also recognizes tireless efforts that United Network of Young Peace Builders and other partners continue in leading and shaping the youth.
You have muted yourself. And now you froze. Would you maybe turn off your video to improve the internet quality? I think this is a great example of what it's like to work in places like Sierra Leone and a great.
Okay.
Robert, are you back with us?
I think I had a little break, but I'll just pick up from where I left off.
That was amazing.
Okay.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Yes, I am. I hope you can hear me now. I'll just pick up from where I just left off.
Yes, please do.
All right, so it is undoubtedly true that young people have faced unprecedented challenges in the past years owing to multiple crises, the coronavirus pandemic, climate change, violence, and armed conflicts, and their compounded effects. However, the mobilization of young people for peace, social justice, climate action, and equality remained unfaltering and critical to the peaceful development of societies. Young people have continued to drive peace, even though the impact of the pandemic has reinforced barriers and created new challenges for the meaningful participation in peace and security processes. As a result of a deliberate action of the United Nations, a reason for which we're here today, page 16 of the Secretary General's report reference that a civil society working group on youth peace and security led by the United Network of Young Peace Builders and Global Network of Women Peace Builders was launched in December 2021 to advocate for the meaningful and intentional integration of civil society and youth perspectives into the deliberations of the Security Council. This is true and deliberate manifestation of the United Nations commitment to putting young people at the helm of affairs. Unfortunately, you'll agree with me that the safety, security, and protection of young people have not improved. There have been several reports of shrinking civic spaces, coupled with the impact of armed conflict and COVID-19 pandemic, lack of political will on the part of governments to allow for a level playing field and equal opportunity for youth. Political intimidation and discriminatory policies have led to severe protection challenges requiring urgent action. It is also true that young people, women in particular, are at risk of being left behind in terms of education, economic opportunities, health, and social protection during a crucial stage of their lives, and the lack of confidence in the systems of governance at local levels are also a huge challenge. Meanwhile, on page 8 of the Secretary General's reports, he mentioned that initiatives as the Youth-Specific Civil Society Protection Network of Global Network of Women Peace Builders and UNOY are actual to address the gaps and improve protection. This does not in any way ignore the tireless efforts of local youth peace builders across Mother Earth, but were identified as best practices, which should be possibly replicated at other local levels. This is to be made possible through inclusive partnership with young peace builders, which is crucial to the youth peace security agenda. It must be prioritized by all partners. Learning from best practices that have stood the test of times, preventive efforts can only be effective if use is made of the capacities, perspectives, contextual knowledge, and creativity of diverse groups of young people, as captured on UNOY's publication. The institutionalization of the youth peace and security agenda has noticeably accelerated since the first report on youth peace and security, but yet profound challenges persists that concern meaningful participation of young people in decision-making and financing for peace building that is led by and inclusive of young people. Local politics, on the other hand, continuously have been used as a powerful negative and divisive tool, creating distrust among young people and instability in our communities. Local multilateral organizations are also caught in this web, as they are mostly influenced by local politics that dictates the manner in which they allocate funding or resources to youth groups and civil society organizations. To a larger extent, some civil society organizations and youth groups might be blacklisted or considered illegal if they are not seen as being pro-government, whilst those that can be easily manipulated are set against each other. Despite all of these challenges, however, highlighted above and in the UN Secretary General's report, the report did mention on page 11 that tools such as the United Network of Young Peace Builders checklist for meaningful participation provide practical guidance for strengthening engagement with civil society, including youth groups. Therefore, we must endeavor to utilize such resources and others that may also be available by other partners within the YPS platform. For example, the Cora Voices Fellowship for Young Women Peace Builders provides a platform to its peace building program that aims to support the development of young peace builders and ensure that more young people share Cora's vision for sustainable peace and the strong and integral parts of our global culture. Such fellowships are very important for the achievement of the YPS agenda, just as the Global Youth Mobilization Fund also provides opportunities for youth-led initiatives to access funding support in recognition of their invaluable work at local levels. Just like the UN Secretary General's Youth Envoy stated to the UNSC on 27th April 2022, I would draw the curtain down on my speech with the following statements. This is an opportune moment to take stock of the youth peace and security agenda, its progress and wins, and its challenges and gaps. I'm sure we all agree that the future of our communities, countries, and the entire world depend on building peaceful and resilient generations. This is also a strategic moment to further increase synergies among these various agendas, so young people in their diversity can contribute as equal partners and stakeholders in deciding what kind of a future they will inherit. We all have a role to play, but to whom much is given, I would also say much is required. Leadership does count. And with these few words, I'd like to say thank you once again for the opportunity to deliver this statement, and thank you all for your undivided attention. May peace prevail on earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Herbert, for those remarks and for really reflecting on the entire report. Some of the things that were mentioned are very, dear to us, especially when it comes to protection and the shrinking civic space, without which definitely youth-led organizations and individual young peace builders work keeps becoming more and more challenging. And for those of you who have not read the report, it's called If I Disappear. That was published by the Office of the Secretary General NYU in 2021. I would highly encourage you, if you're curious about some of the findings when it comes to shrinking civic space, especially young people's experience in it. Some of you might have contributed to that report yourselves. And I will now move to Jorge Valderrabano, who is the Executive Director of Agora Mexico and also the Regional Coordinator for Americas at the United Network of Young Peacebuilders. Jorge, what opportunities exist to enhance accountability on the YPS agenda, and how can we ensure regular reporting and accountability on the peace and security agenda implementation? Over to you.
Hi, dear Eliska and everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate today. I'm sorry that I couldn't be in person. I was trying to do so, but I kind of overslept. I had a wild night. I'm sorry about that. But I'm here participating online. I'm coming from an organization from Mexico, as has just been mentioned. It's called Agora. We've been increasing the
Maybe if you can try turning off and off your video so that we can hear you.
You cannot see
We cannot hear you. Your voice is breaking too much.
or you cannot listen. Is it better here? Maybe I'll just have to connect to the Wi-Fi.
Yeah, now it's working better.
Okay. So I was saying that we've been giving conferences, workshops on this topic from the organization that I co-founded some years ago in Mexico, which is called Agora. I'm gonna try to, is it better now? Okay. But mostly we've been accompanying processes at the local level, no? And the implementation of projects that have an impact on the SDGs or in peace building, social justice, reconciliation, as we've been saying in Mexico, no? Building partnerships between civil society organizations, but also looking at opportunities for collaborating with governments, UN agencies, the private sector, which has been mostly a necessity in the last years, no? So they can provide guidance or resources for the implementation of activities with a youth approach. And we've been working on this at the local level, no? In Mexico, when a new government won with a leftist ideology, and they opened the dialogue to get to know the necessities, the proposals from civil society, that's when we realized that we have to incline to the YPS agenda. And that was an opportunity to make our voices heard. So we decided to join networks and to collaborate with other partners and stakeholders that were mostly involved in this agenda. And that's when we joined UNOY, the United Network of Young Peacebuilders, beginning in 2020. As a member organization from Agora, it was an opportunity to get to know other peers in the region, to strategize collectively, to understand the opportunities for moving forward this agenda at the international level and doing advocacy in these spaces, but also for implementing actions at the country level for the translation of this agenda to our context. I joined this network in 2020 when everything was still online and we were already collaborating in specific activities. We actually organized a side event in the high-level political forum that year in collaboration with the Ministry of Economics from Mexico to reflect about the advances in the region, the regional coordinator for America at UNOY at that moment also participated in that process, and explaining about the important role that we have in conflict resolution, in peace building negotiations, and to get to know what's being implemented at the local level. At the end of last year, when I decided to move to New York, I also became the regional coordinator for America. It was a strategic position, being able to participate in these kind of meetings, advocating on YPS in these spaces, while at the same time coordinating the actions of organizations in the region, or actually facilitating the collaborations and networking between the members. So at UNOY, we care about activities at the local level for increasing awareness, visibility of the agenda. We're also implementing projects at the regional level. No? Last year, we conducted a training program on our protection protocol, in which we provided education on how to engage in these conversations and act locally while taking the necessary measures to protect ourselves, to reduce risks at the both individual level and institutional level, so we can continue with our work as activists and as peace builders. For example, as a result of this process of the protection protocol training program, some organizations implemented activities on this matter. For example, an organization from Brazil called Lacemos, which has been working a lot on climate change. They conducted a survey as a follow-up of this process, no? To know the necessities of young people, and more in terms of mental health, no? And to create better proposals for promoting the health of young people that are participating in human rights activities. Other organizations, such as the one that is located in Chile, for example, did other follow-up actions, such as adopting a protocol themselves for their organization, and also conducting a training among their members in the country, no? And these and other organizations have presented this work in forums such as Stockholm Plus 50, in Glasgow, here at the UN as well. And none of these activities have received technical or financial support from any UN agency. Also, none of these efforts have been documented. They have not been presented to policymakers, no, in any of decision-making spaces, to know what's going on in the ground, which are the necessary projects to implement, and how to do it, no? Right now, as the regional coordinator for America, I've been drafting our advocacy and communications strategy to get to know which are the stakeholders with which we would have to collaborate and which are the proposals we would like to push forward. We just published our report on Latin America. It was based on a series of consultations in 8 countries, and we are disseminating this material, but of course, it's a research exercise that could also be considered in the strategic planning of the Secretary General or of the General Assembly or the Security Council, not to actually get to know which are the perspectives and notions of young people in these topics. And for me, it's all about providing evidence of what works locally, no? And I believe that we are lacking a lot of mechanisms from UN agencies, from governments as well, to share what's going on, no? To explain our necessities. We've been doing research, we've been implementing projects that could be evaluated, no? That could be considered in these decision-making forums. So that's what I would like to inquire about, no? How are they envisioning to create channels, to create bridges between vulnerable populations and people that are drafting policies at their desks here in New York, no? But now that I'm based here, I would love to get to know other organizations that are working on this topic and to strategize better so that we can have a common agenda and a voice that is more firm and more united, so that we can push forward our topics. Yeah, I'm eager to kind of get to know your perspectives, not to listen to you so that we can have a better approach in this forum specifically. But thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm here to know which are your questions and how I can collaborate so that I can advocate for YPS.
Thank you so much, Jorge, for all these ideas and the examples from the local, the regional level, some of the you've made so many points that I'm not going to try to summarize, but especially the point on research is, I would say, extremely important. This is a point at which we tend to get stuck at when we're told, but where is the research? Where is the data? And young people have really taken it upon themselves to do that research, to collect those data, whether it's through more formal academic institutions or through informal settings, because I think they're all very tired. I know I am tired of hearing that where is the data when we indeed have projects and programs that produce great impacts at the local community. They're just not in a format that is easily digestible by huge institutions. And finally, we will move to Marcy Donnelly, who is the youth delegate from the Baha'i International Community. Marcy, thanks for joining us. How can young people, particularly those at the grassroots, marginalized or with little access to internet, contribute to reporting on the youth peace and security agenda? And what is the role of local and national youth-led organizations in ensuring this? Over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so lovely to be in a space that's so action-oriented. And I wanted to thank the panelists that have gone before me, because I'm so inspired by all three of you and what you're doing and how frank you are in these spaces, and honest and truthful, which is what we need to, create united institutions that are functional. So as was mentioned, I wanted to focus on the implementation of this report at the grassroots on all levels of socioeconomic background and marginalization. But especially I wanted to focus on something that the Secretary General speaks about a lot in this 2022 report, which is a lack of political hope in younger generations, and a lack of political will on the global stage, and how these two are connected, and how necessary it is that we rise past this to actually achieve any action. So what is often forgotten with all these wonderful achievements we've come to, whether it's the Sustainable Development Goals, this report, or even the creation of the United Nations itself, is that local communities, specifically youth, have been providential in all of these cases in getting these radical ideas off the ground, which brings me immense hope, even in a time which may sometimes feel hopeless. I'm a Baha'i, as was mentioned, and as a delegate in person at HLPF this year, I went into it inspired by this very poignant and lofty quote from the Baha'i writings, which reads that world unity is the goal to which a harassed humanity is striving. A world growing to maturity must recognize the oneness and wholeness of human relationships and establish once and for all the machinery that can best incarnate this fundamental principle of life. So it states unity as a fundamental principle of life, and tells us that we have to create machinery. So the question is, how do we take this theory that's accepted in rhetoric in the world and implement the machinery for this lofty goal? So the question mainly asked was about, how do we bridge this gap? How do we bring the global to the local, and how do we involve youth at the grassroots? Obviously, the report focuses very much on how leaders on the international stage can listen to youth, implement youth voices, create spaces for youth, but not all youth are able to reach that global level. So how do we ensure their voices are heard? So basically, I have developed 3 points I'll try to get through, because I don't want to take up too much time. But first is the importance of local communities, the logistical importance of local communities, not just the, again, rhetoric importance of local communities. Second is creating spaces for youth-centered discussion at the grassroots, not just on an institutional basis. And third is why we need to have a global framework and centralize our actions. And it's more of a question really than a comment on my part. But first, the Secretary General highlights in his report that there is an extreme mistrust in democratic institutions in the youth, and this stems from the local level. So to build that trust, on one hand, the institutions must be reflective, yes, of the aspirations that they represent, but on the other hand, youth must also have spaces in their local community to discuss the principles that should underlie their institutions. In these spaces, youth also must learn how to communicate effectively in intergenerational environments, which in turn spurs those in the global stage, youth or adult, into action. So the importance of a framework rooted in a process involving constant action, creating spaces for discussion, is actually often neglected when we think of what action is. So in order to establish the political will in governments, which if you were at HLPF was a phrase repeated over and over again, was a lack of political will without much discussion on how do we bypass that lack of political will. So to establish the political will in governments, the hope at the local level that spurs political will on the global level needs to be cultivated. And I think this is done through youth-led in-person spaces to discuss and act that addresses that challenges the SG has brought up about a lack of political will or lack of political participation. So as a response to youth feeling hopeless in our community, just to kind of bring it to a real life example, some friends and I made what we call the coffee house. And this place was designed to be where an action reflection process, as the panelists before me have spoken about, is carried out. So artists, peace builders, friends come together to discuss the assumptions and principles that underlie major events in the world in order to better our communities. And that is the purpose of that space. Basically, its main goal is to encourage the will to act in young people who feel hopeless. And this is in Canada. We're still at the beginning of this process, but we've seen insane progress, mainly in the arena of young people feeling like they should be engaging in their communities, local, national, or international. And this is done through conversations that empower young people to make change in their neighborhoods and employ their talents and passion to bettering their communities. And of course, then when any one individual takes on an initiative, there's this intergenerational network of youth and adults that support and encourage that initiative, which drives political will on the global level. And because of the dire nature of our global crises, making space for discussion among youth, honest discussion that sometimes involves talking about our hopelessness, can be neglected. And this is understandable as we're at a critical juncture in our society where action is needed more than ever. But by creating these local spaces that are city or town wide, realities are read. And this allows for youth working at higher levels to understand all that needs to be addressed in their nations. So for my final point, I wanted to talk kind of about establishing a framework that all youth, as we was asked in the question, we talk about the digital divide. We talk about women and girls and other marginalized communities not being able to access even this agenda because of this divide. So how do we make a framework for action that encourages youth to act? How do you translate something like the coffee house that has around 300 people following this endeavor just in my city with 70 or so people coming at a time into action? And I'm still trying to figure it out right now. But what I do know is that this generation of youth is extremely connected and can be a tsunami of change with the right motivation manifested in a common framework. So if all of our actions are manifested towards one common goal. And there are already examples of common frameworks that transcend divides, even though it seems idealistic. And we need to read our own reality to create a framework for youth-led, whatever that looks like. Is it having a common set of principles? Is it focusing towards creating functioning global institutions to solve global issues? I'm not sure. But an example I can offer because of my familiarity with it is that of the Worldwide Baha'i community and what they're doing. Because they have been learning about how to create spaces for all, regardless of background, socioeconomic, religious, anything, to build flourishing societies based on unity and justice, which acts as a common framework for all and encourages active participation in community life and service. And it's able to express this common vision in formal and informal efforts at various levels of community action, where young and old work together to build vibrant communities that then are stronger, sustainable, and can respond to global issues and push global action. It also involves discussions on not only action, but the morals and principles that underlie those actions, so corruption doesn't begin to translate into higher levels of government. So we're in uncharted territory. We know civil society drives change. We know that there's political will lacking on political levels. We know there's political hope lacking in communities. In order to drive change, we need to empower the local level to be protagonists of social action, make them aware of this report, create spaces to speak, and to feel that they're capable of transforming the world, because the most transformative ideas have always been pushed by local communities. Anyways, I hope my experiences have given you some ideas as yours have for me. Thank you so much again for having me in this space.
Thank you so much, Marcy, for sharing your experiences, especially at the very local level. I sometimes think that we're not really thinking at a neighborhood level, even when we talk about local, we're still thinking much more about national level. And I think this is a great example to show that change really starts in your house, in your family, and in your neighborhood. So thank you so much for providing that example, but also for pointing out the lack of political will that we have all around us, that young people have experienced, but also to really show that we're not waiting around for political will to be there. We're demanding it, and we're offering great ideas. We're offering ways to do better. And I want to thank all the four young panelists today for offering your reflections and your suggestions. And we will do our best to make sure that they also reach member states and different UN representatives. So this is the end of the first panel, and since we're running slightly behind time, I will already give the floor to Katrina, who is going to moderate the second panel. And as I said, unfortunately, we won't have space for questions and answers at the end. So please keep putting your questions and reflections in the chat. We really appreciate it. Over to you, Katrina.
Thank you so much, Eliška, and thank you so much to our three panelists from across different regions in the world. Now we are turning it over to the second panel on recommendations for youth inclusivity in national level peace and security planning processes. I'm very excited about this. So since the fall of 2019, our organization GNWP, the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders, has been partnering with the Center for Global Affairs in the School of Professional Studies at the New York University, as I had mentioned earlier. And we've been doing this to deliver a student practicum and explore conditions for women's meaningful participation in peace negotiations, implementation of peace agreements and post-conflict recovery. And now this year, we focused on the youth inclusivity in national level policy processes. As part of the overall practicum, which is organized periodically, a group of students work under the supervision of clinical professor Dr. Anne-Marie Getz, who I introduced earlier, to conduct research into priority themes related to women's meaningful participation and other intersecting priorities, which are identified by us together with the students. So we support the students, connect them with our local and national partners, provide access to data, and this time data included youth peacebuilders themselves, and we connect students to local people who work on the ground on these specific issues and other UN or international frameworks who are working on the policy side of things. We have worked together with the students to ensure that their feedbacks or findings are translated into concrete recommendations, which inform our global and local advocacy efforts to ensure women, and in this case, young women's effective engagement in ongoing peace and conflict processes. So in 2021, a group of 6 students, and I want to name them to recognize their work. So Alona Despin, Cynthia Saxena, Dennis Avida, Jen Roach, Nikki Stuman, and Sarah Zahibi, several of them are online and in person, all joined us with Dr. Getz, or Anne-Marie as we call her, to showcase perspectives on youth engagement in operationalizing peace and security at the national level. And we did this by focusing on several country case studies, including the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Iraq, Jordan, Nigeria, the Philippines, and Tunisia. I also want to recognize that several of the audience members were themselves peacebuilders and youth peacebuilders that were participants in this research. So thank you so much for the time and energy you've contributed to the overall research and findings that you'll be hearing about in a second. So I have the pleasure of introducing 2 of these 6 student researchers, so Alona Despin and Cynthia Saxena, who will share some of our findings and recommendations based on what they've heard from youth peacebuilders themselves. So without further ado, over to you, Alona and Cynthia, to give us an overview of what you heard.
Sure, thank you so much, Katrina. I think we have a presentation to be pulled up for all of you for hopefully ease of what I'm about to take you through with Cynthia here. Thank you so much to all of the wonderful panelists who are here today. It's hard to follow all of you, and we're so happy to be here with you, and thank you for attending online and in person. So as Katrina already went through a little bit of our research, which is highlighted on the next slide, I don't need to spend too much time talking about our report itself, but in short, we talked with many local peace builders across those 6 countries that were named, and really talked about how youth and young women in particular experience inclusion and exclusion in national YPS mechanisms. And on the next slide, you'll be able to see our different countries, the places where youth coalitions, official processes such as NAPs, or neither are in place. So on the next slide, I just want to take you through a very short snapshot of our findings. They will be available online, so I don't want to take too much time going through it. But just to give you a few things to highlight in particular. So first, youth reported very high levels of cynicism and mistrust in official government YPS processes in our interviews. They were not inclined to participate in some fora, and they were not inclined to trust the overall possibility of success for some of these mechanisms, including MAPs, which is important. Like, there is hope, but there was also a little bit of wondering if anything would fully come of these things. Second, we did want to highlight that the number one thing that was reported to us in terms of a youth priority across all 6 of our countries were jobs and economic freedom for young women in particular. And then third, we found that a lot of the challenges and barriers that young women reported to us were largely unaddressed in YPS systems, but also in WPS systems as well. And then we'll go on to the next slide.
So the last point that Alana has made about women falling through the cracks is a really important one. The mechanisms that we observe for engaging young women in YPS are the same as for young men. Women engage just as much as men do in YPS systems. However, with the major exception that often young women's priorities are not really focused on, such as security threats, sexual harassment, sexual and reproductive health, that are addressed more so under WPS rather than YPS. This was very noticeable as a pattern throughout in our research in all 6 countries. And when they do try with the WPS to address these issues, it's not really well received, because under WPS systems, almost everywhere, there were serious problems of exclusion due to gerontocracy. As senior women were quite patronizing actually in a lot of areas. We found this specific quote from Jordan, where a young one peace builder said that the response that they get from older women is that this is our work, we have worked hard for this, and that we should find our own thing. And they do not want to collaborate with the younger women. Young women are therefore siloed to being related to WPS and not to YPS, which leaves them without really a place to voice their concern, which is why we're saying that it's almost like they're falling through the cracks. They can't recognize their place in either YPS or WPS systems. And even in the government processes, when countries are sort of creating this NAP or YPS in their countries, there's limited accommodation for young women's priorities and limited meaningful recording of young women's concerns. The country that I focus on was Nigeria, and we spoke to one of the interviews we had was someone who was part of this YPS consultative process, who said that just a ballpark, he said there were about like 40% women in those consultative processes, but there were actually fewer than that if you actually looked into the data. So next slide, please.
All right, so we did want to take a little bit of time to highlight some of the really key cross-cutting issues that came up in our research for YPS, some of which we did see in the SG's report that just came out, but some that we also thought were maybe not adequately addressed. So first, we wanted to touch on the theme of LGBTI engagement. Concerns from LGBTI youth peace builders across these 6 countries were voiced to us in terms of acceptance, safety of their community members, and this included both in the digital sphere and in person, just the ability to be on the streets, coming to youth peace building events or anything like that. Especially in the MENA region, this was very prominent as to how they are able to just live decent lives with dignity. Second, on climate change, this was of course very much highlighted in the SG's report, but I think our research actually reflected a little bit of a different side of this issue. We did find that in the Philippines and in Nigeria, some young people did voice the desire to have climate and environmental justice reflected in the NAPs in those countries, but it generally did not make the cut. But the really interesting point that we found was actually in Tunisia. A lot of our interviewees did say that they weren't really concerned about climate change, because when you're worried about where your next meal is coming from, you're not really wondering about what you can do for climate justice. And so they voiced it as saying that climate is only something that you can worry about when you're privileged enough to do so. And that was really interesting for us because our interviews were taking place around the COP26 conference last year. And, you know, that's something that is just so remote and out of reach for the Peacebuilders that we are speaking to. And also the point that only those with leisure and wealth are in a position to influence that realm at all. It really suggests that there's a strong need for climate change activists to really articulate the connections between the YPS, intersections, the SDG 16 intersections, and the rest of the Sustainable Development Agenda, the YPS agenda. On sexual and reproductive health, young women in many contexts have a lot of early care responsibilities and associated gender roles, and in some cases, very early motherhood. And so when it comes to questions of how we manage those relations, how we manage sexual health, those should be considered more heavily in topics of peace and security planning, and it would be very valuable to explore those connections between SRHR and peace. And that was something that we didn't think was really highlighted very well in the most recent report. Another thing that came up for us was migration, especially in the Philippines. Multiple interviews were very concerned about large IDP communities in Mindanao. And then in both Tunisia and Iraq, there was a large theme of emigration from the country, largely due to the government cynicism and mistrust, loss of hope, no available economic freedom or opportunities. So youth generally leaving in mass because they didn't see the opportunity for change in their own country. Next, on religious institutions, this is another really important point because we find religious institutions to kind of play a very powerful role in communities in terms of identity, in terms of success or failure of peace building work. And the impact of religion on peace building is something that hasn't necessarily been highlighted enough. This was really brought up in Iraq for one of our examples. It served to actually undermine a lot of YPS coordination efforts for youth there because no one was willing to quote cross religion or ethnic boundaries in order to collaborate together. In the digital realm, we did want to say that some of our findings were a little bit in contrast to the general hopeful kind of tone of the SG's report on digital. We did find that across a lot of our countries, digital was a huge barrier for a lot of youth peace builders, especially those from rural or more impoverished communities. They were not able to access a lot of these digital spaces in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. There was a lot of Zoom fatigue towards the end of that that we also found. And then really one of our interviewees put it very succinctly from the DRC, saying that, as a quote, poverty is preventing connection. So we did notice, obviously, that a lot of these themes were reflected in the SG's report, but we also wanted to really emphasize that some of them deserve increased attention, both from UN mechanisms, but also from other research going forward. We'll move on to the recommendations.
Yes, so future research and organizational efforts towards the student YPS resolution requires addressing the concerns that we have mentioned in our presentation and are there in our report. So in our report, all of us, we came up with sort of 6 solid recommendations to follow. Number 1 is the consistent data and clear indicators for measuring impact. Stronger data is needed on the design, composition, and in conducting consultative processes. A lot of speakers before us have also brought this up, that data must also be disaggregated by gender, race, ethnicity, and sexuality to accurately identify patterns of youth exclusion. Number 2 is that young women should not be reduced to girls and should be seen as a distinct demography. This evidence of the marginalization of young women's concerns in general, but specifically the lack of mention of sexual and gender-based violence, sexual reproductive health, and right, as well as LGBTQI+ issues, suggest that the current strategies are not properly addressing the needs of young women. Number 3 is to uphold conditions for intersectionality, sort of going back to the first point, that more action is needed to ensure that women and sexual and gender minorities are not only equally included in consultations on YPS, but that these spaces are also safe for women and LGBTQI+ people to feel that they can genuinely share the full range of their concerns. This was a point that kept coming in a lot of the countries, that women didn't even feel safe enough to travel to a lot of these consultative processes. So that's like a big hindrance for them to actually participate. Number 4 is to localize the YPS agenda. So the most direct and efficient way to begin decolonizing peace building is to consistently and consciously localize the YPS agenda and collaborate with organizations that are already working on this on-the-ground work and are already producing intersectional and high-quality work. The YPS agenda must be owned and operationalized by young people themselves, rather than trying to find their space in older networks, like I mentioned for the WPS before. Number 5, challenge patterns of elitism and exclusion. Localization is a strategy to aid in combating the elite skew of YPS work. These include things like urban biases, association with the UN sometimes, technical language, digital access, sort of what Alana mentioned before. And we can do this by identification of appropriate forms of communication and language that is actually used in local contexts and by local activists themselves. And lastly, to combat projectization of donor funding, to effectively localize the YPS systems and agenda, there must be effective efforts to combat projectization and short-termism in donor funding and financing models. We found that a lot of funding was only given for a few months for a project, or it was very low. This includes providing longer-term flexible funding and core organizational support, and focusing on process and sustainability instead of only reporting. So yeah, these recommendations should be carried out in conjunction with the understanding that meaningful inclusion means listening to young people, appreciating their concerns, and acting on them in ways that are designed and directed by young people to make them feel safe, equal, and crucial in co-creation. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation.
Thank you so much, Alona and Cynthia. This is really wonderful. I have one question before we close off our session today. You talked about the projectization of funding, but funding, as we know, is a larger problem in this space, specifically for youth peace builders themselves. We know that the majority of youth-led organizations operate on a budget that is far below $10,000 a year. We've heard this time and time again. So in terms of the research that you've conducted in the 6 countries and from whom you heard, did you find mitigation strategies that youth peace builders or organizations are already doing, and to be able to combat the scarcity of resources or the issues that come with having such little resources to do such vital and important work?
Yeah, so I think we have maybe 2 interesting points on funding. The first, in terms of mitigation strategies, I mean, we just need to do better about funding at the grassroots level, especially. I mean, it's well known, but our research also showed that a lot of the youth grassroots organizations were significantly more underfunded than even the youth organizations that were like a little bit larger and more established. The funding tended to be channeled into those. So yeah, the youth grassroots level was a compounded problem. So like Cynthia just mentioned, I mean, youth have been advocating for more targeted and long-term sustainable funding, and that is going to be a major help. But one of the other things that we think is really important to mention too on this point is that donors need to be more collaborative. So for example, some of our interviewees reported to us that there's a really big tendency to fund whatever the hot topic is in a location. So, you know, when something happens in, say, Tunisia or Iraq or something, like not every donor needs to go in and fund humanitarian aid. We need donors to talk to each other in order to say, okay, I'm going to fund humanitarian aid. You can fund SRHR. You can fund this peace building and conflict prevention. You can fund mental health. And so if we don't have this collaboration among donors, certain aspects are really being left behind and not getting the funding that they need. And then I think also Cynthia had an interesting point too on donor funding, if you wanted to
Yeah, so I focused on Nigeria, and there were these two big youth organizations that I focused on. One of them gets most of the funding, so they do have a lot of collaborations with each other. However, one thing that I noticed, at least the people I interviewed in Nigeria, were these sort of young women who were students as well. So they were in their master's or PhD programs, and they kind of work with these organizations as like unpaid interns. So it's sort of the same thing, which is like everywhere, that the only people who are able to do these unpaid internships come from a certain level of privilege. But the one actually really surprising thing that I found in Nigeria was, while we were doing this project, Nigeria came out with their National Action Plan for YPS. And if you read through the National Action Plan and the section they have about like acknowledgements and thanking people, they thank oil and gas companies and they thank the Chinese government. So it's also then surprising to see that if you don't have funding coming from proper channels from like the government or UN agencies, that I mean, in like this desperation or something, they might turn to not so savory partnerships. So that was something interesting.
Thank you so much. Very interesting to highlight this link with other types of sources of funding, I guess. I do want to highlight, and Eliska might want to speak more about this, that the response to this lack of and scarcity of resources is also what became the Youth Peace and Security Fund, which was launched a year and a half ago or so now. Which is now being incubated at Search for Common Ground and the United Network of Young Peacebuilders, which is a people-funded fund, which is very much in response to this issue that young peacebuilders themselves don't get the funding through local organizations, they don't have access, and of course, the sustainability of funding is not there. But with that, thank you so much to both of you and to the 6 students who joined us on this year-long project, and of course to Dr. Anne-Marie Getz for the partnership as always in the NYU Center for Global Affairs, and back to you, Eliska, I'm sorry, for the closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Katrina. I didn't know you knew my middle name. Interesting, the things we find out about each other. So now I have the very easy job that everyone wants to have of trying to summarize and give closing remarks after an extremely rich discussion that we just had. So I'm not going to be able to mention all the points and all the different thematic priorities that were mentioned, so bear with me. So what I am really taking away from this event today is that peace, and therefore youth peace and security, really means very different things to different people. And it's not up to the global level to decide what are the priorities, how it should be implemented at the national level and especially at the local level. And that context really means everything. And the barriers are so diverse depending on your gender, depending on your country, depending on where in the country you're located. Is your organization allowed to be registered legally? Is it informal, and does it rely completely on volunteer organizations, like so many youth-led groups do? Something that we've heard also is that there is real need for networks like UNOY, platforms like the Civil Society Working Group, to provide voices for young people to be able to directly interact with member states. And I hope we have many member state representatives today, as we have invited also many of them to join us to be able to hear young people's experiences and reflections on the second report of the Secretary General on Youth Peace and Security. As you know, we founded this platform for the civil society organization, especially youth organizations, to be able to dialogue with member states representatives, as this was a request that we kept receiving, that if only there was a platform where member states could interact directly with civil society organizations and especially young people. If we were in an open debate of the Security Council setting, there would have been one person selected, 2 if we got extremely lucky, through an extremely intransparent, rush process. So we hope that this space today was much more inclusive, and that the diversity of voices, as well as the research that was presented, was something that was highly appreciated also by the audience, and that you were able to experience what it is like to do peace building in different parts of the world as a young person. Of course, the second report of the Secretary General highlights the COVID period and what that has meant in terms of digital access and the inequality, as well as what meaningful participation became to mean, as we have seen such a increase in requests of young people's participation, especially in digital UN high-level events where young people were asked to participate, but not necessarily were really given the freedom to say what they wanted to say, nor was there any kind of acknowledgement or follow-up with them, which is why we have taken certain steps as the United Network of Young Peacebuilders to ensure that young people are not just being asked to take part and provide expertise and time without being really acknowledged for all the efforts that they put into it. We know that YPS is the people's agenda. It's not the UN agenda. Young people's work has been ongoing way before the YPS agenda was formally adopted in 2015. But of course, we do have this global framework, and it's important to know how to localize it at the national level. And as a follow-up to the high-level conference on youth peace and security that took place already in January of this year, one of the outputs was the guide on national level implementation for public officials. And this really lays out so many different ways that you can implement youth peace and security depending on the setup of your ministries, of your government in different projects, strategies and programs, and how do you engage young people. So this is a guide specifically for public officials, but I would encourage any young person, any civil society member to really read it. It's a great tool you can use for advocating on how do you go about implementing the agenda at the national level. And it also shows that the national action plan is not the only way to go. And of course, we've seen this with certain countries, that just because you have a national action plan doesn't mean that there is any actually implementation of the agenda happening. And especially when it comes to the question of resources, financial resources that are often the ones that are most lacking in those national action plans. Some of the other themes that were mentioned were protection concerns, especially when it comes to young women and LGBTI people. We've seen an increase in protection cases and in the young people reporting that their work is getting increasingly dangerous over the past couple of years, which was again mentioned in the If I Disappear report. And it's something that we have noticed at the United Network of Young Peacebuilders, which is why we founded the protection network with the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders. And it just shows that if there are other actors like the UN who are not willing to take action to protect young people, civil society steps up and really does it by itself, which is not to say that we're not looking for partnerships, especially with the UN system, to strengthen protection mechanisms that are specific to young people. But I think it shows that young people are not willing to wait for political will or for the UN system to step up and to deliver on the commitments that they've made. And I would not, of course, forget our lovely researchers who are with us today and online. The research findings that you presented are going to be super important for us when it comes to our advocacy, not only because it again echoes the voices of the young people who are doing great work on the local level, but also, as I said before, we're often asked about, well, where's the research to back up what you're saying, as if young people's lived experience and them sharing isn't enough. So now we have increasing amounts of young researchers actually doing the research, since there hasn't been a lot of interest in researching youth peace and security implementation by more, let's say, older researchers. So we really appreciate all the work you've done, and thank you for presenting those findings from such a rich background. And finally, I would like to end on the importance of making young people's work visible and funded. Of course, youth-led peace building has been happening for decades, mainly done by volunteers, but it cannot continue like this. Young people cannot continue volunteering their time if they're ever to leave this precarious stage of their life. And it is not something that I think we as the Civil Society Working Group advocate for. Of course, we rely on volunteers to run as an organization, but we're increasingly really pushing for the resourcing, but also for financial contributions to places like the Peace and Security Fund, because as we've also heard from the researchers, project bound and short-term funding that is extremely inflexible is not a way to sustain youth-led peace building. So we hope that the fund, but also that eventually the UN Peacebuilding Fund will become much more accessible for youth-led organizations and civil society organizations, as that is not the case at the moment. But to end on a good note, I hope this was an extremely inspiring event for all of you listening. It was for me, and I would like to thank all the panelists again for sharing your experiences, for being here with us despite the situations in many of your countries that are happening. And we hope that we manage to also have some member states here with us to hear those messages, and we ask that you take them further and that you use them in the next steps, whether it's at the high-level global forum or further. And we hope that we will actually have an open debate on the SG's report in 2022, before it's too outdated to really discuss. And I would like to end, thank our partner, Global Network of Women Peacebuilders, for hosting us in their office today. And special acknowledgement to Malika Weyer, who is this is going to be her last event. And I just want to thank her on a personal note that it's been great setting this working group up with you, and you're going to be very missed. And we hope that you stick around again as a volunteer. And we will try to do you proud and really carry on the vision of the working group that we created together over a year ago now. So thank you so much for your commitment and for your leadership, and thank you everyone for bearing with us over time. And have a lovely rest of the day, or have a nice evening. And yes, thank you so much for your attention and for all the lovely comments and reflections in the chat. We